I am so pleased to welcome you today to the Luminos LinkedIn Live session, Proximate Leadership, Critical in the Fight Against Learning Poverty. And I have with me today three extraordinary speakers. First up, Armando Ali, CEO of the PAL Network, a grassroots movement dedicated to advancing community-driven accountability in education. LeAnna Marr, Deputy Assistant Administrator and Acting Senior Coordinator of USAID Basic Education. And Dr. Una Osili, Associate Dean for Research and International Programs at Indiana University's Lilly Family School of Philanthropy. And I'm Caitlin Barron, CEO of the Luminos Fund. And we're gathered today to reflect on a set of principles, practices, challenges, and debates that are really fundamental to how we do what we do here at Luminos. Luminos is dedicated to unlocking the light in every child. We partner with African and Middle Eastern-led NGOs to develop unique models of delivering rich, inclusive, supportive catch-up education to help children around the world get a second chance to learn. To date, we've helped over 250,000 children make their way back to school. And one of the fundamental things we've learned along the way is exactly how powerful those kind of global local partnerships can be, particularly in the education setting. Children everywhere cognitively learn to read in very much the same way. Our brains are the same in that sense. But to do so, they begin their educational journey in entirely learning contexts that are steeped in local tradition, in the political realities, and education systems everywhere are essentially an institutional embodiment of the hopes and dreams of any given society's aspirations for their children's future. In a sense, there couldn't be anything more personal and local. And so the challenge, the opportunity we face in education specifically is how do we actually unlock the power of those partnerships between global funding organizations and proximate leaders, between those who are closest to the challenge at hand and indeed have the greatest insight into the needs of their communities. And so I'm thrilled to dive into this conversation today. It is part of an ongoing series put together by my colleagues and I at Luminos around a series of materials that we refer to as the Luminos Method. These are 9 key pillars and practices that we've distilled that are fundamental to the success of our work here at Luminos, but indeed equally relevant to the world of foundational learning as a whole. And so today's session is really jumping off from, it's reflecting on the launch of the latest element in that Luminos Method series, which we call community partners. So Luminos is an NGO. We're funded by many global aid agencies and foundations, but we are also a funder of NGOs. So we work in partnership with African-led and Middle Eastern-led community-based organizations to really co-create a unique model of leveraging the very best of community practices and traditions and marrying that together with global reading science to help kids unlock extraordinary learning in a short period of time. In the context of our work, there's a key role for our team. There's a key role for our community partners. Our team is responsible for curriculum, pedagogy, government relations, design, and funding the work. But our community partners are right there with us, co-creating curricula and pedagogies that are relevant and resonant in the communities we serve, identifying high potential young people who can serve as teachers in this program and supporting the delivery of this program at scale. And so that's our unique little story, our journey, something that started, I think, as kind of a matter of convenience for us, but over time really became a fundamental principle and reflective of core beliefs here at Luminos. But we're excited today to really expand this conversation outward a little bit. And I'd love to start by focusing a bit on the US philanthropic space. And so Una, this is a landscape you know well. And, for many, many years, I think we heard a number of kind of good intentions around the importance of funding proximate leaders, the importance of funding those closest to the problem in order to come up with a solution. but often the practice wasn't really there. And in recent years, we've seen some unlock, we've seen some actual progress on that front. And I'd love to just hear from you kind of what's changing, and is it a permanent change? Are we going to backslide? What can we do at this moment to actually keep, widening the increasingly open door towards the idea of funding proximate leaders?
Welcome, everyone, and thank you, Caitlin, and team at Luminos for organizing this discussion. I'm really thrilled to be part of this very timely and relevant discussion. As Caitlin mentioned, my own background, I'm an economist, a development economist by training, and I serve as the Associate Dean for Research and International Programs at the Lilly Family School. And in that role, I lead and help lead several projects that have relevance to the topic today. So at the Lilly Family School, we do the research and writing for Giving USA, the annual report on American giving. We also lead two very timely projects, the Global Philanthropy Tracker, which was launched last year, as well as the Global Philanthropy Environment Index. So I'll bring that lens to the conversation. It's also important to situate our discussion in the times that we live in. We know we've experienced, of course, around the world, every single corner of the globe, a pandemic of unprecedented proportions, a health crisis, also an economic crisis, and racial and social justice awakening here in the United States, but also around the world, more attention to those issues. In addition, since COVID, the world has also witnessed a number of other crises, ongoing conflicts in many parts of the world, ongoing economic shocks and uncertainty, and also setbacks in terms of international development. So whether it's education or health, we've seen a number of challenges that I think the world is still grappling with. And I will add climate to the number of challenges. What we've learned from all of those, I think, perhaps you could say the silver lining in all this crisis is the importance of community, bringing communities to the center of the discussion, bringing proximate leadership to solve problems, and also maintaining the principle that the people closest to the problems are often the ones who have the most innovative and relevant solutions. So that's a principle that I think we've heard a lot about since COVID, during the crisis, and even since then. But I want to take it back even further. The concept of participatory development, community engagement, you name it in terms of terminology, we've seen this in other contexts, certainly in the development literature. There's a lot of evidence that community engagement and community participation is a vital factor in the success of a lot of development initiatives and projects, especially around education and health. If you look at a number of studies that have been conducted over the past few decades, we've seen that bringing communities to the table when it comes to implementing a healthcare initiative, an education initiative is critical. There are also some challenges. Is that participation truly inclusive? Is it led by the community? Is it induced by the community? And measuring this idea of local engagement and local leadership has also been very challenging. At the same time, there is a bit of good news to reflect on today, and that is that during the pandemic, with our Global Philanthropy Environment Index, we work with local experts in over 100 countries, and there were some dominant themes that emerged during the crisis. We found that philanthropists, local as well as international donors, were much more willing to engage with grassroots organizations and leaders. In fact, they actually wanted these folks at the table because they realized that to really implement solutions in a time of crisis, you needed to engage the local community. We also found a real interest in collaboration, genuine and intentional collaboration during the pandemic, another really important unexpected, unintended consequence of the pandemic, realizing that the range of challenges communities were facing would require more than one sector, but certainly engaging all the sectors together. And finally, the experts emphasized the need for coordination with communities and also strengthening local data collection and infrastructure efforts. In other words, what we found over this period as it is important to engage local communities, it's also important to invest in systems within those communities, whether that's around building capacity, whether that's training resources, so that those communities are better equipped. And then finally, I want to share, perhaps if you had to say what gives us a lot of optimism as we look ahead beyond the pandemic, beyond the immediate crises that we face. Between 2018 and 2020, our team tracked cross-border flows in the wake of the crisis. So during COVID, what we found was that at a time when foreign direct investment, so private capital flows, declined or contracted drastically in many parts of the world, philanthropy and private remittances remained resilient. So of the cross-border flows, we counted from 47 countries, we found about $841 billion. And when we tracked that, we found that philanthropy, which is about 8% of that number, and remittances accounted for the most resilience. They proved to be counter-cyclical. So funders actually responded to the crises that they found. But importantly, they were willing to step up in how they were funding. More unrestricted grants, more funding that was focused on local communities, and an interest in collaboration. So this is not a time where funders were pulling back, but they were actually stepping up, and they were bold in their experimentation. Many of us have heard of McKinsey Scott on this call, but I think it goes beyond McKinsey Scott. We also saw a lot of local funders who were willing to work with partners on the ground to find those solutions. And I think having seen the success, many funders have seen that bringing local communities, local leaders to the table did have a dramatic effect in terms of engaging the community, finding effective and sustainable solutions. Many of them are willing to continue with that model and also to expand it. So if anything, I think the idea of a multi-sector, multi-stakeholder engagement has gained ground. And certainly my hope for the future is that as this model begins to gain momentum, that organizations will also invest in the capacity building side, the training side, so that there can be intentional but also a sustained collaboration between the funding community and the local leaders. So I will stop here because I know we have a limited time for today's discussion, but just want to emphasize that this is a time of great opportunity despite the challenges that we face. And the opportunity really lies in philanthropy's willingness to take risks and willingness to invest in new ways of sharing power and building partnerships that are effective and sustained.
Oh no, that was a wonderful grounding to start this conversation off. And I love when we can start on a note of optimism. So thank you for getting us started that way. And it is really interesting, right, to reflect on all the challenges and shortcomings of the pandemic, how it forced all of us to think differently about what really was a true limitation and what was a limitation in our own minds. And when I reflect on, what was holding philanthropy back from putting more money in the hands of proximate leaders, in point of fact, the barrier was all in their heads, right? There was no real constraint there. And it was really the proof of the COVID-19 funding experience, I think, that made that a reality for philanthropy. Now it's another matter entirely when you're a government agency. And so LeAnna Marr is coming to us from USAID today. USAID has made some pretty profound commitments to what in their language they refer to as the localization agenda, the priority of getting more money in the hands of locally led organizations. And this is a particularly bold commitment on the part of the agency, honestly, precisely because there are some very real challenges and hurdles to get around in terms of making that intention a reality. And nobody's more thoughtful and nuanced on this topic that I know than LeAnna Marr. So I'm so excited that you're with us today, LeAnna. And I'd love if you can just help get us started in the context of sort of what is the latest on this bold goal from AID, and what makes this hard? And in particular, if there's anything that philanthropy or NGOs around the world that can do to help, this is a great call to action moment for you.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Caitlin. And I'm just so pleased to be here on this panel with Armando and with Dr. Osili. And I really enjoyed your comments, Dr. Osili. I think we need to be working much more closely with philanthropy. It's an area that I think we're delving into, but probably not deeply enough. And Caitlin, I wanted to say the barriers for the government are both in our head and they're systemic. So we maybe have double the work to do than many others. And so today what I want to do is really just dive in a little bit to some of the nuts and bolts and things that we're trying to do at USAID and what are some of the lessons learned. So to your question, you're correct. Locally led development is a huge priority for USAID. Administrator Power announced 2 important targets for USAID in pursuit of our localization goals and also to hold us accountable, which I think is really an important aspect of this. But first, the first goal is that 1/4 of USAID's funding should be directly awarded to local partners. This is a big shift for us. I did, however, want to emphasize that our localization efforts are about more than just funding, though I know that funding is incredibly important. So the second goal is that at least half of USAID programs will be locally led, which for us means they create space for local actors to exercise leadership over priority setting, activity design, implementation, and defining and measuring results. Where are we in the education sector at USAID, and what does our most recent report card look like? Well, according to USAID's most recent localization progress report, about 10% of funding for education and social services went to direct local awards between FY 2020 and fiscal year 2022. So I don't know about you, but as a former teacher, I might call that a C on my report card, kind of middling. We've made some progress, but 10%, we still clearly have a ways to go to reach that agency-wide target of 25%. So while moving towards more locally led development has been challenging, I do think we are at a unique moment in time where actors across development are thinking about how we can systematically change and improve the way we work. I'll first highlight a few USAID-wide initiatives, and then we'll highlight a few issues in the education sector that are particularly near and dear to me and things that I've been trying to focus on. So at USAID, as a part of Administrator Power's burden-busting efforts, we are taking a whole of agency effort to address both programmatic and operational impediments to achieving our targets. A few barriers that we are seeking to overcome include language. Language can be a significant barrier for many local partners because of the traditional requirement that USAID applications must be submitted in English. Under USAID's updated 2023 Acquisition and Assistance Strategy, the agency is expanding opportunities to engage in languages other than English. USAID has put in place a new agency-wide program which provides our staff with access to on-demand translation services for final applications, requests for information, known as RFIs, and notices of funding opportunity, or NOFOs, as we call them. Services are initially being provided for Arabic, French, Kiswahili, Portuguese, and Spanish, with more languages coming. We know that applying for USAID funding can be a lengthy, time-consuming, and often expensive process. Where useful, USAID is trying to employ phased application processes. Requesting, for example, as a first step that applicants submit a simple concept note or even provide oral presentations, including in languages other than English, before requiring investment in a full application. We are also looking at USAID staff capacity. Working to build new partnerships and the capacity of new partners takes time and it takes skill. As the agency's budgets and programs have grown over the past decade, our staffing levels have not kept up, leaving too few staff for this critical work. To expand our partnerships and also to be better partners to the organizations we already work with, we are staffing up. We've started these efforts by hiring more acquisition and assistance professionals. So those are the key people at USAID that help us put in place contracts and awards. And we are also hiring a number of new foreign service officers. I'm really proud to say that in the past 3 years, USAID has almost doubled the number of education officers in the Foreign Service. It's been a huge lift for the Center for Education, and lots of people stepped in to help with that goal. We are also working to empower Foreign Service nationals. These are locally engaged country experts who work directly for USAID, FSNs. They represent the largest segment of USAID's workforce. USAID developed an FSN empowerment implementation plan to promote greater equity and inclusion of FSN staff in decision-making, implementation, project design, and other key areas. I wanted to just talk briefly about compliance and reporting requirements. I know that's not a very sexy topic, but it can pose huge and significant barriers to new partners. So one seemingly small example, all recipients of US government funding, so not just USAID, but US government funding, must register in the US government's System for Award Management, known as SAMS or sam.gov. The process can be challenging for many non-US based organizations. In 2023, USAID implemented a number of measures to ease the burdens for agency staff and partners and streamline elements of the registration process. We're working with OMB and other key government agencies to try to make this happen. You can learn all about these efforts and get more information on how to partner with USAID at a new website called workwithusaid.gov. And if one of my USAID colleagues doesn't mind, you could drop that link into the chat room for folks. Turning more specifically to some examples from the education sector, I would like to highlight a few important examples. So we have learned that we need to be intentional and accountable to shift power in our programming. Locally led development will not happen on its own. It requires intentional planning from the start of activity design and employing new ways to collaborate, learn, and adapt. The RELIT program in Senegal, and that stands for Renforcement de la Lecture Initiale pour tous, is a great example of how this can look in practice. From the very start, the activity was designed as Senegal's basic education reading improvement program, supported by USAID, not as a USAID activity. RELIT employs two modalities. The first is a government-to-government award directly to the ministry, and then a second award to an implementing consortium that provides technical assistance on demand with a service mindset to the Senegal education system as the primary client. The technical assistant activities are co-designed and co-managed at multiple levels of the government, and flexibility has been embedded in the design to respond to emerging needs. A recent report on the project noted that Senegalese officials who collaborate on RELIT described the program as an MOE capacity enhancement initiative rather than a traditional education improvement project. Another key area that we are looking at in the education sector is around evidence. Often the evidence that we use is generated in contexts that are very different from where our programs and activities work. We are seeking to strengthen capacity to generate evidence directly in the countries where we work. There is emerging evidence that demonstrates what is important to education officials when it comes to the uptake of evidence and the use of evidence to make policy. For example, a recent study by Harvard PhD candidate Nozomi Nakajima showed that education policymakers prefer studies in settings with poverty rates and racial composition similar to their own. USAID also has provided funding to a startup organization, education.org, that is doing very interesting work. One issue that they are working to confront: current educational synthesis used in the education sector often privileges elite academic sources over valuable real-world frontline contributions, especially from the global South. And I'm realizing there's a bit of irony that I just quoted study coming out of Harvard. So proving my own point here. But education.org is working to bridge this gap by working to source the most relevant evidence globally, including locally generated, previously underused and unpublished gray literature. They work to create a coherent picture from the mass of evidence, not just the evidence coming out of these more elite academic organizations. They then take these findings and translate them into actionable insights in plain English for education leaders. I think this conversation around locally generated evidence is gaining traction, not just at education.org, but on multiple fronts. Many conversations I hear with donors are looking at how we support the development, the capacity building for locally generated evidence. I know that USAID is looking internally at our own mechanisms that we use to generate evidence and how we build in more capacity, but also more use of locally generated evidence. So just in conclusion, and these are just a few of the issues, there are many, but I think some of these are critical. In conclusion, I want to organize others to, or encourage others to join this effort by generating implementation research and innovation on what models work for shared leadership and transition. So we need to be looking not just at what impacts learning outcomes, but really about our partnerships and how we work. We also encourage you to join the effort by funding and financing models that shift power, such as government to government capacity strengthening projects, and by intentionally capturing localization and sustainability in monitoring, evaluation, and learning plans, and providing feedback to all stakeholders. Again, for any new organizations on the phone that have not yet worked with USAID and are interested in partnering, I encourage you to explore workwithusaid.gov, a new resource hub created for potential new partners. We also have a new resource page on edulink.org, which really looks at ways we're working to advance localization. So I will stop here. And thank you again, Caitlin, for the opportunity.
LeAnna, I love that overview, and it's such a great example of actually the hard work required on a myriad of different fronts to turn a sort of bold target into an actual reality. I love how comprehensively the team is thinking through this, and quite honestly, the candor that that the agency is bringing to the fact that there is a profound and almost insurmountable power dynamic between global funders and recipient organizations. And step one in remedying that is being candid about it. And so I just, applaud the efforts of the agency on that front. I know one of the things we find at Luminos that's critical and quite honestly takes time is actually building a culture of candor with the community-based organizations we partner. It is not a day one matter for them to trust that they can honestly share what's working and not working, and actually know that Luminos will be there in the partnership over the long term. And one of the critical things we've learned along the way is sort of don't underestimate the time it takes to build that culture of trust, and know that actually the funding organization has more work to do on that front than the receiving organization. And so I love that framing. If you're just joining us now, welcome to the Luminos LinkedIn Live webinar on Proximate Leadership and its critical role in the fight against learning poverty. I am going to move next to my colleague Armando Ali, but before I do that, I want to encourage everyone to start sharing your questions in the chat. We will throw open to broader questions and feedback following some opening comments from Armando. So please just encourage everyone to be jumping right in. Armando, it is such a pleasure to have you with us. And I think in particular, the story of the PAL network is a particularly important one for this conversation of what does it take to really fund grassroots movements effectively with global financing. To help us get started, Armando, can you just give us a quick overview of what is the PAL network and what does it do?
Thank you, Kathleen, and thank you for inviting us to join this conversation. I hope you can hear me. I would like also to greet Una and LeAnna for wonderful insights to this topic. PAL Network is a movement of unsatisfied parents, mothers, fathers, caretakers, who started going from household to household, trying to find out if children could read a very simple story, or if they could do a very simple maths operations. The movement that started in India rapidly spread to many other geographies, because in many parts of this world, there are concerned citizens like us who are trying to see if their children are getting benefits from going to school. I would say that we started as a very disruptive movement of intruders in the space of education that was mostly often dominated by experts, by global scholars, by global north thinkers, and we came up with a movement of the global south led by citizens asking a very, very simple question. And that question was, are our children learning? And that's what made this movement start, just to find out if our children are learning. Maybe with not surprise, especially in many parts of the global south, years of conducting this kind of research made it very clear that many of our children are going to school, but they are not learning. And this movement somehow demystified the idea of schooling is to learning. When it started in India, as I said, it rapidly expanded to other countries in South Asia like Pakistan, and Nepal, and Bangladesh, and it also expanded to some countries in East Africa with the WESO program led by civil society organizations in Kenya, Tanzania, and Uganda, and was then adopted also in Senegal, in Mali, Nigeria, Mozambique, and Botswana. In Latin America, we have also members in Mexico, in Colombia, and in Nicaragua. And what brings us together is this idea of finding ways to make citizens as active participants in the search for solutions to improve learning outcomes for all our children. So what we do essentially is to take the assessment and take the evidence to where parents are. We conduct our assessments in households, different from other assessments that are conducted in school, because we want to have a better representation of all children, those who attend school and those who do not attend school. We conduct also assessments one-on-one because we do not assume that all children can do a paper and pen test, because many of them cannot even read, so they cannot comprehend what that is stated in the test. And we conduct these assessments also in the presence of the parents because we want to start with them a conversation about the importance of their participation in the learning trajectory of their children. The citizen-led assessment pedagogy or methodology, if we want to call it, is now used in many countries and is now mapped to global proficiency frameworks, and it's designed currently also to monitor achievement of SDG 4, especially SDG 411A. So this is in summary what the Pearl Network is. We converge as a movement from the global south, trying to put foundational literacy as a priority globally, and learning from each other's experiences and trying to voice collectively so that our thinking, our priorities, and the way we see the world can also be heard in other global platforms.
Armando, it's a wonderful overview, and I know you're battling connectivity. Armando is in transit in Uganda, and we are so grateful that he is sort of transcending the limits of our interconnectedness to be with us today. If I can I'll just recap some of what you shared in case the audio was challenging for any of our listeners. So Armando was just sort of situating the PAL Network's perspective on the challenge of fundraising for grassroots organizations by talking about the role of this unique organization, which began really as a set of parents who were dissatisfied with the quality of the education their children were receiving, and really from the bottom up mobilized citizen-led accountability measures for generating exactly that kind of non-traditional data that LeAnna Marr was just talking about, and actually using that as a force for social change. So Armando, that's a great overview. I know we're going to want to throw open to the audience for questions in just a moment. I wonder if connectivity permits, share a quick anecdote or two. What's it like trying to fundraise for a grassroots organization like yours?
I'm not sure if I got very well your question, because I'm having some challenges with sound, but I had something related with how do we mobilize resources to make the network function. I would say, as any other network, to put the structure and the resources in place is challenging. And I will say that it was easier when we started as just a movement, and our objective was mostly bringing the family together, organizing learning sessions and sharing what we are doing, and finding collective solutions for our problems. So at that time, when we were essentially looking for resources around 800,000, 900,000, it was quite easy to mobilize resources and to make the network function well. But one of the lessons of our trajectory is that although we all share the same principles, voicing together is something very important. So we started finding ways of us talking and voicing together. And the way we found it collectively was to start running common projects. So we are now running common citizen-led assessment projects, and we can give the example of ICANN, the International Comparable Assessment of Numeracy, that was run in 12 countries so far, and we are now in the last stage of development of PAL LeAnna, which includes the language component. So developing and conducting common assessment.
Oh, gosh. And I think poor Armando's connectivity issues tell us exactly how challenging it can be for grassroots organizations to fundraise from global organizations, not least of which the challenges of making sure their voices are heard. But I appreciate the sentiment he shared, and I know from some of our previous conversations, he's really talked about how there was a sort of first wave of funding that he felt like the PAL network could access. Everyone was willing to put a small amount of money at risk for a grassroots organization. But as his organization's grown, they've reached one of those challenging kind of missing middle moments, right? Where there's sort of funding available for startups and funding available for organizations at scale, but often a real shortage of money for organizations in that middle zone. And we've got a really interesting question in the chat, which I think builds on that theme from Armando, because there is one very famous donor in the US philanthropic landscape who is doing her level best to actually change that scaling narrative for a number of kind of medium-sized nonprofit organizations. And so I'd love to, perhaps as a closing question, just throw out to all three of our panelists for anything you'd like to share. How, in your views, has the sort of bold philanthropic giving from Mackenzie Scott sort of changed the conversation in your part of the world? Is her giving really showing a way for funding proximate leaders in new and more significant and more ambitious ways than have been done before? Like sort of like, is there a sort of healthy discomfort that bold, generous giving of that kind prompts in maybe some of the more established funders in the space?
I can start because we've spent quite a bit of time thinking about this. I think the first principle that I'll lift up from her giving is the role of unrestricted giving. So as funders think about how to partner with local organizations, with grassroots organizations, building in flexibility is key because especially in this fast changing environment, unrestricted giving has enormous advantages as far as innovation and creativity are concerned. The second is lifting up equity concerns. Gender equity is, of course, a big theme in her work, racial equity, but also bringing marginalized voices to the table. And in many developing countries, it may also be re-engaging rural communities, rural leaders in discussions, who's been left out of the equation. And then finally, in addition to funding proximate leaders, I think her giving has also lifted up the notion of trust, building trust with partners. It takes time, but it's very critical. One very prominent example was a very large gift to Howard University, a historically Black institution. And the president shared with us that that was the largest gift that organization had ever received in its multi-century history, but also that there were no restrictions and the donor trusted them to make decisions. So I think a big call to action for funders is build trust. And in order to build trust, of course, that takes time, but also understand that you can go much further when you're able to establish those trusting relationships with your funding partners.
It's a great synthesis, Una. And LeAnna, is there any positive call to action coming off of McKinsey Scott's giving in the international development arena? Is the word leaking through in a helpful way?
I do think that there is. I mean, she's certainly generating a lot of conversation around the flexibility around giving directly. And I think actually just to close, I might add a little twist and answer just a different question around this and around some of the barriers to this. But I think it's a little bit hard sometimes for us to shift our mindsets. So one of the questions that I frequently get from some of our more traditional implementing partners is, you know, what do we do, for example, if evidence and localization or local partners there's tension there, that maybe local actors may be asking for something that we don't have evidence for. And I think it's, in some ways, we need to look at that question differently, because first of all, when we talk about local actors and local voices, it's not a monolith, right? And there may be, and I think Armando brought up parents, right, who are just such a huge key stakeholder, important voice as we talk about localization. And often parents have very different views than the Ministry of Education. And one area, I just look at the work that USAID has been doing around language of instruction. And we know what evidence in high resource countries like the US and Canada say, but does that work in countries where you have multiple languages? Or we maybe know that's working best, and maybe I take Kenya as an example where we've generated a lot of evidence that teaching in Swahili actually works better than teaching in English to teach those foundational learning skills. And yet in many communities, parents want their children to start in English because they see that as an advantage. And I think there's real concerns there. So I think this idea is about partnership and how we're increasing the fold and bringing more partners and more voices in together, rather than sort of this evidence versus local or whatever that might be. So I just encourage us to make the tent bigger. And I think Mackenzie Phillip is demonstrating a really good example of how to do something bold and different and be innovative. And the last point I would just make is I think sometimes there's a certain risk aversion on the part of government donors. So we are under tremendous pressure from our governments to produce results. And so sometimes the easy thing for us to do is to work with that known entity that has produced results for us in the past. So we have to be willing to take risk and we have to be willing to try new things. So, and I will just leave it there.
Well, I think that's a fantastic call to action for all of us, LeAnna. And nothing could be a better note to leave this on, right? The challenge before us is not to bring a local voice into the tent. It's to bring the cacophony of local voices into the tent, right? Government, teachers, parents, and the children themselves, who also very much deserve a voice in their education. So I love this conversation. I think it's entirely appropriate that we're battling with connectivity because that's what it's all about. It's about bringing other people into the conversation. Armando, thank you for hanging in there with us. And it was so important to have your voice in the conversation. Thank you all for joining us today, LeAnna Marr, Una Osili, Armando Ali. It's been my great pleasure and privilege to host all of you for the Luminos Method LinkedIn Live on Proximate Leadership. I invite everyone to take a look at the latest installment of the Luminos Method on our website, our community partners element, which really details how it is we've gone about building partnerships of this kind at Luminos. It's one of several models and approaches out there, but one I think we're really proud of. Thank you all for being here today, and best wishes in the day ahead.
Great. Thanks to Luminos for bringing us together. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all for joining.